Hello. So, I have just read the first 7 chapters, I believe, of Shaman's Crossing, and I'm gonna talk about it now. First time starting a new series since the channel's inception, so slightly terrifying for me, but here goes nothing. Hopefully, hopefully this will be as interesting as reading the Cosmere was. So, I don't know where to start here because I have a lot to talk about just in this first section alone. This is an extremely thematically dense book so far in these first 7 chapters. I might leave some stuff to talk about later once certain themes become more developed, I think. So I might just mention them now. but I'm going to start by sort of going into my overall impressions, I guess, and some of my thoughts about where the story is going. So, first of all, I just want to say this book is, unfortunately, sort of perfectly made to not be my kind of thing right from the start. I do like it and I think it's good, but it's good despite the kind of book it is. What I mean by that is I am not generally a fan of the, autobiographical style of fantasy novels, sort of like Patrick Rothfuss. That's just not really something that I enjoy as much as other kinds of fantasy. Like the stories that begin with the protagonist's childhood and then carry him through his entire life. So that's already something that's just, I don't mind it, it's just not my favorite. I'm also really not a big fan of very military fantasy, which this does appear to be. And I also prefer my fantasy worlds being a bit more fantastical than this one seems so far. This is a very much a world based on a very specific period in real history. Sort of the age of colonialism, I would say. The colonization of North America, I think, is probably where a lot of this is coming from. And there are already explicit fantasy elements, but those fantasy elements are fairly minimal. Now that could change as we go forward, but so far the world building just feels very low fantasy, and that's just not my favorite thing. Other than that, I like everything. I like everything else here. Like I said, this book has really gripped me, despite all of its disadvantages, I guess, in that regard. Which, if anything, this serves in the book's credit. So don't take these as criticisms necessarily. So, I have sort of a couple of major themes I want to discuss here. And then also some thoughts about the plot. I think I'm going to start with the plot, actually. And the characters. So really the only character we get a ton of development for here is Nivare himself, which makes sense. He is the main character, he is the point of view character, and like the in-universe narrator. But we do also get some interesting development for his father. And so far, Nivare seems like, well, he seems kind of basic as a protagonist. He seems kind of like a straightforward, like he's like the straight man of the story, as it were. Which I don't think that's where he's going to end up, actually. Because I think that there are some hints here that there's more to Nivare than meets the eye. And I don't just mean the supernatural hints that he's got some kind of link to the land or whatever. I mean that at the start of the story, it is clearly hinted that Nevare's sort of very repressed, regressive, conservative version of masculinity that he sort of embodies and aspires to is not something he came by naturally. It's not something he developed. He developed sort of casually and that fits him like a glove. It's something that had to be forced onto him. At the start of the story, when he's a little kid, we learn that his father essentially took him away from his mother and sisters to quote unquote make him more of a man, and that Nevare sort of naturally gravitated more towards the female influences in his life as a kid. Of course, by the time we get to 18-year-old Nevare, which is where the story is now, he has clearly sort of fully internalized his father's myopic version of masculinity, which is very harmful to both him and other people around him, I think. But I'm hoping that there's still some of that original Nevare in there, that as we go forward and as he gets more in touch with the side of him that we see on the boat here in this final chapter, I'm hoping that he will sort of come out of his shell and become the kind of person his father would be less proud of, which is a good thing. When your father sucks as much as Lord Burvell does, you should aspire to be the opposite of whatever he wants you to be, in my opinion. I think that's a pretty good guiding philosophy in life. Be the kind of person Lord Burvell would be ashamed of. I think that's what I'm trying to do in life. Not for my father, by the way. I'm not saying that. I love my dad, but if I had a dad like Lord Burvell, I would very much aspire to be the opposite of what he wanted. So yes, I do think that there's this interesting trajectory ahead for Nevare, and like I hinted earlier, there is a supernatural element to that as well, which is that the dream he has while he is off being trained by Dewara, I'm not sure how to call that man, the asshole plainsman. While he's off being trained by Dewara, he has this vision dream thing, which Nevare dismisses as a dream, and it obviously wasn't a dream or a vision. Like, it obviously on some level actually happened. Both because this is a fantasy novel and therefore it would be really weird and boring if that dream wasn't real, and also because there are clear material consequences to the dream. We know that the reason that a part of Nevare's scalp is missing is not because that was Dewara's punishment for him, but because the speck witch who he met in his vision tore off a part of his scalp. We also know, of course, that whatever, at least I suspect, I don't know if we're supposed to immediately make this connection, but I made this connection, that in Chapter 7 on the boat, when he is seeing the huge forest float by, and he is overcome with this sense of almost religious devotion towards this forest, this overwhelming urge to worship it, to see it as a god, to go inside and live in it. I think that is very clearly some kind of influence that the speck witch left inside him, because from what we know of the specks, they are the people who are intimately connected to the forest. That's where they're from. Their magic is tied to the forest. Their powers are tied to the forest, etc. Unlike the other plains people who are obviously tied to the plains. So I do think that going forward, we will see Nevarre, probably not for a while. I suspect that now when he's going into the academy, he's probably not going to be in a position to encounter untamed nature for a long time. So I think maybe this thing that we got hinted here on the boat is going to sort of go into remission and be forgotten by Nevarre for years probably. And then my prediction is when he's sent out into the field, and when he probably goes out to the spec forests in the west, which is where I'm guessing he's going to be sent once he's done at the academy, it's going to hit him again full force. And he's going to have to confront whatever is going on inside of him, whatever the witch did to him. And I do think, by the way, he is going to make it through the academy and go and go west, because it just feels like the trajectory the story is naturally heading towards. I don't think any major diversions will happen to the line of his life before then. I think we're gonna probably just sort of speed through his time at the academy in a couple of chapters. I could be wrong. This book could be something completely different. But that's the vibe I'm getting. The vibe I'm getting is that the arc of this book is naturally leading towards the west, even as Nevarre is heading east. But that is also an interesting thing to think about. When thinking about the future of this series, I find myself asking the question, from what position is Nevarre narrating this story to us? What stage of his life is he at? What stage of the story is he at? Is Nevarre going to narrate all three of these books to us from a point in time at the end of the third book? Or is he narrating from a point in time at the end of the first book, and the version of Nevarre who is currently narrating has not yet experienced the full story? The reason I ask that is because the narration implies that up until the point at which he is narrating this story, Nevarre has not encountered Dewara again since his childhood. And that seems unlikely to me. Rather, it seems unlikely to me that we won't see Dewara again at some point in the future. Which to me seems to suggest that there's going to be more story after the point at which Nevarre is narrating. But I could be wrong. Dewara could just be a one-off character who never shows up again. Who knows? But just the way that Nevarre narrates kind of feels like he still doesn't quite know what's going on, like he still isn't aware of whatever is going on inside of him, mystically speaking. And he still speaks very positively of Gurnia and of his father and of the king and all that in the present tense. He doesn't just talk about how he felt back during the time that he's narrating. He talks in the present tense about how he feels now. And I don't think that by the end of this story, Nevarre is going to feel that good about his father or Gurnia or any of that. Just because it would be weird if he did, because it's clear that where the story is going in that respect. And that brings us to the main theme of this story so far that's being explored, usually not directly, because Nevarre himself has not had much chance to engage with it directly, but rather indirectly in the interactions between side characters, in offhanded mentions. It's sort of being built up. And that theme is colonialism. So obviously, this is a story about colonialism. The Gyrnians are violently conquering and colonizing the territory of the Plains people. And now they're moving into the Spec territory to the west. And we see lots of very explicitly colonial discourse going on. We see we see Lord Burvell talking about how the Garnians have a duty to uplift the plains people into civilization. He has this sort of very paternalistic white man's burden attitude towards the plains people. If you don't know what white man's burden is, it's a poem by Rudyard Kipling, which is horrifically racist, as you can imagine from that title. And there's just all sorts of references to stuff like that. You see, for example, when Sergeant Durrell tells Nivare his story about a whole tribe of plains people committing suicide by jumping into a rushing river, rather than be colonized, be quote unquote civilized by the colonizers. And he says, well, some of the men despaired after that. They felt guilty because they felt we drove them to it. But no, they were just crazy. That's why they did it. And like, no, you literally, physically drove them into the river. You were attacking them with their backs to the river. So you see this, we are seeing a horrifically violent colonizing genocide, essentially, being portrayed from the perspective of the colonizers here. And that's why none of the characters we really meet so far actually talk about it in negative words, but it's really clear that these people are monsters. Lord Burvell is a monster. He was at the forefront of a genocide. Like, putting aside the fact that he is also a terrible, abusive father to Nivare, he is just a horrible person. And because we are seeing him through the eyes of Nivare, who currently shares a lot of the values of Garnian culture, we are seeing Lord Burvell portrayed as sort of a very honorable man, sort of the ideal member of the nobility. And I'm hoping that Robin Hobb agrees with me that he is in fact a monster, and that will eventually come up as the story continues. I feel like she does. I feel like that's what I'm supposed to take away from a lot of the things he says, especially a lot of the things he says about the Plains people. In particular, I'm thinking about the first chapter, where Nivare protects the half Plains people, half Garnian girl from getting sexually assaulted by a bunch of boys. And Lord Burvell basically says, well, I mean, obviously it's bad that almost happened, but like, really, it's her dad's fault for having a mixed-race child in the first place, and for showing her off in public. And we don't really see a ton of Lord Burvell being that overtly awful after that. Towards the Plains people, I mean. He's awful towards Nivare later on. But I feel like there's a reason why we opened with that particular chapter. And I feel like as I go through this book, it will become more and more obvious why Robin Hobb decided to specifically open with that scene. Because that scene has not come up again so far. Nivare has not thought about that experience once since it happened. But there's a reason that the book opens with it. And I think that reason is not just world building, but also set up for the kind of person that Lord Burvell is, and hopefully the kind of person Nivare will grow up to be. I still don't know if Nivare is going to end up being a heroic protagonist that we're supposed to agree with by the end of this story, or if he's kind of going to end up being a villain who we follow. That would also actually be interesting. Now that I've said that, I kind of want that too. I kind of want a version of this story where Navarre never realizes that he's in the wrong, and we just get to see the story through the eyes of someone who is on the wrong side the whole way through. I don't think that's what's happening here, because the forest thing speaking to his brain feels like it's gonna push him in the opposite direction. But it could happen, and I wouldn't mind if it did. So yeah, that's most of the stuff I have to say here. Let me think. Is there anything else? Oh yeah, I do also want to say, I like that even though this is obviously a story about the horrors of colonialism, the indigenous population who is being colonized are not being portrayed as the noble savage trope. They are very much portrayed as deeply flawed and messed up sometimes cultures and individuals in their own right. They are allowed the full breadth of humanity, which I like. They are allowed to be both victim and victimizer. We see how some tribes of the Plains people sided with the colonizer. We see how some of them conquered other tribes, etc., etc., warred between each other. This is not a case of an idyllic pre-civilizational paradise being encroached upon by the horrors of civilization, which is how a lot of especially older anti-colonial narratives tended to play out, and that was very racist in its own right. So far I don't really have any issue with the way that the theme of colonialism is being handled here. I'm not necessarily super well versed in post-colonial or decolonial theory, but I have read a fair bit of it for my research, and I do think that so far Robin Hobb knows what she's doing here, and I like it. We'll see how much that continues to be the case going forward. But right now, I feel like this particular series, while it might not have as much interesting plot stuff going on as something like the Cosmere, I feel like it's going to be more fruitful for my particular brand of sort of socio-political analysis. At least I hope so, because I like talking about that stuff. So, that's about all I really have to say about these first 7 chapters. I decided to do my first video after a slightly smaller chunk of the book than I usually do. Just because, well, it's starting a new series, and B, these chapters were so dense with stuff I wanted to talk about. I will see you next time, where I will go over, I don't know how many chapters. I haven't decided how I'm going to break this book up. I think I'll probably just make that up as I go along when I feel like I've reached the end of a thematic hole, and I just felt like Navarre moving out of his childhood home and going to the big city felt like a good moment to sort of close sort of an act 1 for this story, or even a prologue maybe. Yeah, I will see you next week, where I think we will probably get to see the Kavala Academy in Old Taurus, I believe it's called. Yeah. See you next time.